Welcome to On Becoming a Healer, a podcast where we focus on the formation of healing interactions in medicine. We often talk about how we interact with patients, but for this episode, we'll be talking about how we relate to the people who work with us in medicine. In this episode, we're talking about race, an episode, a mistake, if you will, a mistake that was racially fraught, maybe even racist, although I confess I'm going to be struggling with what word to use for the entire episode. What makes this unique is that we'll be discussing that episode with two people who are most affected. One is my co-host, Dr. Saul Weiner, and like me, he's an academic doctor, and it's his error we'll be talking about. And the other is Chanel Brown. She is a recently retired administrator in a large health system, and she's the one who got to experience Saul's error. And for reasons I'll explain, the friendship and respect between them gives us a special opportunity. But let's first say hello. Hi, Saul.
Hi, Stefan.
Hello, Chanel, and welcome to the podcast.
Oh, hi, Stefan. Thank you.
It's really nice to have you. Can you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Oh, absolutely. Well, my name is Chanel Brown, and I am a retiree as we speak now. But I worked at the University of Illinois for 32 years, and I worked with Saul Weiner for probably 10 or 11 years of that time frame at being at the University of Illinois. I've lived in Chicago approximately probably 41 years. Prior to moving to Chicago, I came from my hometown, which is Sanford, Florida, probably like 45 minutes from Orlando, Florida. So I came to Chicago at the age of 13. I was living with my grandmother at the time. And then at the age of 13, I moved to Chicago, where my mother resides. And I started high school here in Chicago. And the rest is history.
And Saul, I'm going to direct this to Saul, but I know you've worked together for years, but Saul, how do you know Chanel?
So Chanel and I met sometime around 1999, I believe. I was young attending. I had just finished my residency in 1997, and I found myself just a couple of years into that job as a med-peds attending, assuming responsibility as a program director of an internal medicine pediatrics residency. And I needed a coordinator for the med-peds program. And I think there were several candidates for the position. And I remember meeting Chanel for the first time when we got together in a small conference room in pediatrics. And we started talking about working together. And it was a long time ago. It was over 20 years ago. And then we began this process of running a residency program together just at the time, actually, when the internet was very young. I mean, the first few years, everything was paper-based. And then we had to kind of transition to the system that's used for managing residency applications online. So so that's how Chanel and I met. And as you mentioned, we worked together very closely for 11 years.
Chanel, is that pretty much how you know Saul, or do you want to add anything to that?
Yes, that's pretty much correct. I met Saul between August and September of 1999, in which I interviewed for a med-peds residency program coordinator position. And obviously, I became the program coordinator. And that is basically how our relationship began.
So we're going to fast forward a few years. But Saul, I think the key here is, what is the episode? What's the racial or racist event? What did you do, man?
What I'm about to describe was something that I'd sort of pushed to the back of my mind and hadn't thought about for many years. But just a few months ago, an email popped up from Chanel that had gone to a lot of people saying that she was going to be retiring. And I should say that after I left the role of med-peds program director, someone else took my place. And then after that person did it for a number of years, someone else took their place. And so Chanel had been in this role for an awfully long time, and she was retiring. And so I looked at this email, and I started to feel emotional feelings, just like, wow, this is like the first person I worked with. We had such a long run together, and I started to feel kind of sort of nostalgic, I guess I would say, to think back to those days. That was a very different stage of my career. And so I sent Chanel an email just kind of congratulating her on her retirement and saying, could I take her out for lunch? And so we just had a nice exchange and agreed to get together for lunch. And then during the several weeks between that email and when we went out to lunch, at some point, this incident came back to my mind. And I don't know exactly when or what triggered it, but I remember I was at dinner with my wife, Suzanne, and I related this incident to her. And I said, I'm just wondering, I'm thinking of bringing this up with Chanel. This is something that happened that I've remembered. I'm wondering if this was some sort of, I guess the term people use now is a microaggression. And so I related it to Suzanne, and she was like, yeah, you do need to bring that up with Chanel. That's something you should talk about.
I'm on the edge of my seat. I want to know what the incident is.
Yeah. So what happened is that, and I kind of have to cringe because I feel badly about it now, but hey, it was my idea to talk about this. So what happened is, I think it was maybe the third year we were working together, somewhere pretty early on. The way residency programs work is you have candidates who come through. These are medical students who come through, and there's a very intense period in the middle of the season, that goes on for about 3 months, where we have to interview all these candidates and select just a small number who we rank, and then that's how it all works. And Chanel was kind of at the heart of that. She would actually meet all these candidates when they came and give them tours and show them around and so forth. And I should also mention that we worked very closely with the internal medicine residency program and the pediatric residency program. And there were a variety of other stakeholders, department heads, who all were critical to the success of our tiny little MedPeds program. And without giving away, who it was, one senior administrator kind of, I remember we were on an elevator together, and that administrator, she kind of rolled her eyes and she said to me, "Have you got to do something about the way Chanel dresses?" And I remember when she said that, kind of two things went through my head. One was like, well, what is she talking about? And then at the same time, like, oh yeah, I guess maybe Chanel does need to change the way she dresses. Like, both of those two things went through my mind at the same time. And I have to say that I felt a little intimidated by the senior administrator. I also felt like I wanted to impress this person. I felt like I needed to, also show that I could be the director of a program and so forth. So I kind of took it upon myself that I was going to talk to Chanel about the way she dressed. And I don't remember the details of how Chanel dressed. I think maybe she can kind of relate that better. And so long and short of it is, I kind of pulled Chanel aside, and I don't remember where we were at the moment, but I told her that there were some concerns about the way she was dressing, and she needed to dress differently. And, the implication was that she was dressing in a way that wasn't professional. She had to be more conservative. I don't know what words I used at the time. I remember feeling kind of bad about doing it, but I also felt like somehow I was maybe helping her in a way. I thought, well, maybe given her background, she might not know what like the appropriate dress is in this environment, and so maybe this is a good thing, and so on and so forth. And so, I talked to her about this. Yeah, and I kind of felt to myself, well, she's not going to feel good about this, but this is kind of my job as a program director. So, I had all these things going through my head. And I could tell she wasn't too happy about it, but like, I felt like I had done my job. And so that was it. That was like, if you're program director, sometimes you have to do difficult things. So, anyway, and then to my satisfaction, Chanel started dressing quite a bit differently after that. And so I kind of thought to myself, well, okay, I guess this worked. And I think this senior administrator, I don't know what, I think, she didn't ask about it anymore. I don't know if I went back to her, but we all seemed to think that like, Chanel had learned a good lesson here and had learned how to kind of dress right. And so that was the incident. And then, somehow I pushed it to the back of my head. And then, like I said, it was only many years later that this came back to me. And I will say, one other thing I want to share is there's another individual who is a Black woman and who is also a good friend of mine. And I've noticed how she dresses, and I've come to realize that the way she dresses is very appropriate and really fits with perhaps Black culture, the way Black women dress. And yet it also reminded me of how Chanel had dressed that day almost 20 years ago. And so I started to connect the dots and say to myself, I think I have a problem here. There's a way perhaps in which I've changed. And I'm now looking at a situation very differently than I did that day way back in, 2002, 2003. So I will say that I think that was part of, it was knowing this individual and seeing how they dress that to some extent triggered my thoughts about this incident.
I have to acknowledge that I was cringing through part of the story, but it's really important to hear. And I want to ask Chanel what she remembers What do you remember of this conversation with this young attending about your dressing?
Oh, wow. Let me start from this point. When Saul and I met for lunch, and he mentioned to me, he said, "You might not recall this, or you may recall this, but there's something that I need to confess to you, something I want to say to you." And he asked, "Do you remember when I called you into the office to discuss your dressing attire?" And I said, "Absolutely. Of course, I remember that." And so that's when he brought it up to me. I was like, wow, what's the reason behind that? And he apologized to me and asked for my forgiveness because in his thoughts, he thought that was considered a microaggression, especially during what's going on in this time and age. So much racial tension in this world today. So maybe that could have helped trigger him coming to me and apologizing. But in reference to the incident itself, Saul called me into his office, and I wasn't quite sure what we were going to be talking about or meeting about. And naturally, I was anxious about coming to his office because, mind you, I was just maybe a couple of years into this position when this meeting happened. And so I walked over into his office, and we had a discussion about my dress attire during recruitment. Saul expressed to me that a senior administrator feels that my dress attire was inappropriate for recruitment. Oh my gosh. After that meeting, I left the office and I was very much perturbed. I was offended. Of course, I didn't express that only because I just was a couple of years into the job. So I didn't really want to express my true feelings of what I felt. And so I pretty much heard what he had to say, and I just said, okay. And at that point, I left the office. But when I left the office, Stefan, like I said before, I was very much perturbed and offended by what Saul had just said to me. I probably shared this after I left my office. I mean, it kind of had me in a mental state of, I was so focused on what just had happened. I probably shared this discussion with a close friend immediately after I left Saul's office. I probably got on my cell phone and said, can you believe, question my dressing attire? It made me second guess how I dressed because personally, I did not feel like I was dressing inappropriately at all. I did not understand. I didn't have any understanding what just had happened. I thought I was dressing appropriately and professionally. Inappropriate dressing for me would be attire or provocative. Let's use that word provocative. Provocative dressing to me is someone, basically a female gender, that might have body parts exposed to suggest something sexually. And my attire did not demonstrate any of that at all. And so that's why I was very confused about the meeting and me being addressed about my dress code. So in retrospect, though, this is what I feel what happened. And this is just in retrospect. What happened that day to me was an act of racism. I know Saul used the term of micro racism. I didn't find anything micro about that. I thought that was a very aggressive move that was prompted by a senior administrator, and that this type of racism, I feel that it stems from racial biases, beliefs. For example, a person might unconsciously or consciously believe that people of color are more likely to be dangerous. Or another example would be a woman of color tends to dress provocative in her attire. That's also a bias statement. And with these bias statements and bias beliefs, what happens, Stefan, is that this arbitrary grouping of person becomes a tool for justifying the cruel treatment and discrimination of non-white people. So basically what I'm saying is that you already have this biases in your way of thinking already. And it feeds on that individual turning that biases into a very racist act. And I think that's what happened. And that's just my thought behind this.
So there's sort of two aspects here. One is very material. The clothing was not particularly revealing.
No, the clothing wasn't particularly revealing. I mean, what tends to happen during that time, 20 years ago, I'm a person that's definitely I'm into physical fitness, and probably during that time, and very shapely. So during that time, I was probably at the prime of my fitness. I was very much in shape. I'm in shape today, but really in shape then, which can, I guess, allude to, especially when Black women style of dressing might be form-fitting dresses. I mean, I'm not saying all, but some that are physically fit, they may wear form-fitting dresses sometimes. And then people that are of the Caucasian persuasion, as if I may say, they may perceive that as being provocative. I attribute that to based on could possibly be body form, body shape, and clinging clothes. I remember an incident that happened with a well-known athlete herself. I don't know if you guys remember this, Serena Williams, who got in trouble for wearing a catsuit on the tennis court. I remember that. But the twist to that story, and I mean, she really got reprimanded for doing that, but she had a medical reason for doing that, because what it did, she said that it helped with her, not that my dressing helped with my circulation, but she dressed in that catsuit for a particular reason because it helped with the circulation. She dealt with blood clots and it helped with her circulation, her blood circulation. But the whole point of me mentioning that is that I feel like non-Black people, when they see a woman of color that have a different body shape from them and wearing clothing that might be form-fitting, they associate that with being inappropriate or being provocative. When we both, women of white and Black races, we both wear form-fitting clothing.
Yes.
And I've seen women of white race wear form-fitting clothing or short skirts, and nothing became of that. There was no talk about it. There was no meeting about it. There was no confronting about it. It was okay.
Yeah. I mean, the word provocative here obviously is about the capacity of someone's mind to be provoked. Not in what you're saying. I mean, and that was part of what I wanted to bring out, and you did bring it out, is the clothing fit the form. The form is one which for some audience, probably more white than other, but I have no idea, probably more white than other. They're provoked, but it's just clothing that fits a form, and it's a different type of person. There you have it. That was the clothing part, but the other part of it is also, how did this affect your view of the situation in the place where you worked? I mean, how did this affect your work experience?
To be honest with you, after that meeting, and like I said, now that I think about this, it really disturbs me how it affected me. It had me to second guess my dress attire and to take me out of who Chanel is. How it affected me is that it made me dress differently than how I would normally dress. I dressed differently, but that wasn't me. It wasn't me. From that point on, what you would notice, you would see Chanel in slacks most of the time. You would see me, you would rarely see me in a dress. Rarely. And people that knew me, that was still working at the institution where I was, some of them that really knew me, they was like, I don't see you in dresses anymore. And I probably made up some skills. Yeah, I don't feel like wearing heels or something like that, something crazy like that. But that particular incident had an effect on me. And from that time on, periodically I might wear a skirt or something like that. From that time on, it did set the precedence as to what I would wear to work, really. And
so a long-term change in clothing, because of a fear.
A long-term change in clothing, and for the fear of being approached again about my dress attire. How dare they? How dare they?
And the word "they" is really important here because this is such an interesting episode because it involves a request from a senior person to Saul, which you didn't know at that time, right? I don't think or did you know it was from a senior administrator that he was, in a sense, folding in his face of a request, or did you think he was initiating it?
A lot of things went through my head, Stefan. I think he said a senior faculty or something like that, but it did.
Just to interject, I remember, Chanel, you reminded me when we were at lunch that I had shared with you that it was a female. Which actually I'd forgotten. Female. Yeah, and I remember now that I shared that with you, that it was a female, because I somehow wanted to justify that this was not like just a male thing. So that I think is why. And I'd actually forgotten that, but you did remind me. I mean, you didn't know who it was.
No, I didn't know who it was.
But you reminded me of that when we had lunch.
But you did share that it was a female faculty. So here I am. When he said that, naturally, the wheels are turning. I'm trying to figure out who in the HE double hockey sticks said that. Who said that? And I mean, I was really taken aback by that. Naturally, I couldn't really share my true emotions then, but when I got behind closed doors, I had to talk to a friend and say, what are they talking about? You know, and it just, from there on out, it just gave me a different perspective about Saul. At that point, I just felt like he was not an advocate of mine. And I felt like I was in that department on my own.
That's a big change to a work relationship, to feel that your boss is no longer an advocate, right?
Absolutely. Yes, that's what I start feeling. And when he told me that it was a female, and like I said, I was at a very high standard of fitness, I attributed that to some form of, this is just me speaking, some white woman envying the body structure of a Black woman. Because mind you, Stefan, I didn't have anything. There was nothing revealing.
Yeah. It's just
very
the form.
Curvaceous. Yeah, the form, very curvaceous and fit. And that's the only thing, that's the only conclusion I can come up with, really. And when I talk to other friends, other African-American friends, they say the same thing. And I'm just appalled of how anyone that is non-Black, particularly any Caucasian person, have the right to dictate how one should dress.
And this dictatorial action, not necessarily a microaggression, but a racist action. When you use that word, what does it mean there?
Trying to have a sense of control over people that are non-white. Yeah. It's about a sense of power, a sense of control. This is how I want you to dress, or this is how you should look. But my question again, and it's a very simple one, who are you to tell me how I should dress and how I should look?
Who are you? And we're going to come back to, in a moment, to how your view of Saul Weiner evolved over the years that followed. But I think it's important to ask Saul, what's your reaction? You've already heard a lot of this, or you've thought about this, but do you have any additional reactions to your assessment of what you were doing at the time or now that's changed even in this conversation, Saul?
I think the first thing to be very clear about is that looking back, I realized that there was absolutely nothing wrong with the way Chanel was dressed. Chanel was very finely dressed, and I now appreciate that. So let's just get that. For anyone who has any doubts, there was nothing inappropriate about the way Chanel was dressed. So given that, I think there are a lot of things Chanel's saying that are really important here. I mean, if you think about it, here we had a white woman and a white man, both in relative positions of power. The white woman actually had power over me, and I had power over Chanel. But this woman and myself, and actually really me, I was the conduit, are basically telling a black woman how to dress. It's a form of kind of almost controlling her body. And as you can see, it had a very lasting detrimental effect on her. It changed the way she felt about her work environment. It changed the way she felt about me. It changed the way in which she felt about the culture in which she was in, the feeling that she was alone, that she didn't have an advocate. So it really had a pretty profound effect. And I think what's interesting when I think about my own role in this is, and this is where I think the whole idea of institutional racism becomes relevant, is that I was caught up in a system, right? So I wanted to look good to this senior administrator. I was willing to, although I was a little taken aback by the senior administrator's kind of reaction to Chanel, I was quick to buy into it and to perpetuate it and to actually do the deed, to cause the harm. And in so doing that, I was securing my own position as somebody who, quote unquote, could be a program director, could do their job, and in so doing, causing a harm to Chanel. And what's interesting for me is I've never thought of myself as quote unquote racist. I mean, what white male does, right? And yet that was a racist action, and it caused harm. And that's why I find it so important to talk about it now, and in particular to hear how it affected Chanel.
Yeah. And lest anybody who's not African American in the audience wonder, as the white host, I'm both feeling judgmental of Saul and coming up with a long list of reasons why I would never have done the same thing, which is, of course, BS. We have no knowledge as to that. And I think we have to just let that sort of sit to the side for a moment. But that discomfort is an important thing to notice. Chanel, now we got to come back to the evolution of your view of this young Dr. Saul Weiner, because it isn't the case that you left. You continued to work with him. And I guess I'm curious, how did you come to see the guy, since there were many years that followed of working together? What did become your view of him?
After he left his position, I mean, the view really didn't change until I was cordial when I would see Saul, but that view as a young Saul Weiner, I mean, it really didn't change up until the point when he asked for forgiveness and when he brought it up. Not that I dwelled on what happened, but because it was brought back to my attention, I definitely remembered what happened. And it did not feel good. I can attribute a lot of that coping mechanism with my Christian values. I am a Christian, but do not mistaken my Christian values or having Christian values as something where I sit and not do something when I witness anything that is considered injustice. Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King, he was a Christian as well, but he was a civil rights activist, and he fought for injustices. So being a Christian does not mean that you sit back and let just injustices roam in this country.
Yeah.
And so personally, doing this podcast, I really appreciate you guys inviting me. I'm hoping that it really speaks to someone's spirit and maybe give them a change of heart of how they view people of other races in different forms.
It almost sounds to me like you're saying that some of your Christian understanding of sin and pursuit of justice led you to say yes to doing the podcast.
Well, it did. Because it did. I mean, at first I was kind of apprehensive about doing it because I did ask Saul, who will hear this, and I mean, who's going to hear this podcast, and what was the purpose of it all. But if this can help someone have a different view of their approach to others that are not like them, then I think this would be of great use.
And Chanel, and I'm going to ask both Chanel and Saul this, do any of us think because this story took place maybe 2002, is this just ancient history? Should we assume that women of color do not face the same requests about their clothing today?
Of course they do. Of course, it still exists today, and it's still going on today. Let me just put it this way. Until the person of power acknowledge their wrongs, we will continue to have these type of incidences. Because the only way we can move forward is that you have to acknowledge that wrong has been done to an individual, to a group of people, or to an individual person to rectify the problem.
Saul, do you have thoughts or responses on the idea of having had an enduring effect from a year 2002? I can't imagine it's easy to think about.
One thing that I struggle with is how easily it is for this type of thing to happen if you're in a position of power over somebody else. You know, when I think back, I mean, now I obviously cringe at my behavior, but at the time, when I put myself back into that period, it almost seems like it was inevitable, given the fact that I didn't understand at that time that the view of how a Black woman should dress was really none of my business or none of this senior administrator's business, particularly given the fact that, as I said, there was nothing inappropriate about the way Chanel was dressed. But I just kind of fell into this idea that, oh, well, there's a professional way to dress, and Chanel is not dressing professionally. And I just kind of bought into that. And what did that mean? Well, it didn't mean anything. Professional was being defined through a very narrow cultural lens. It was a white lens, and it was absolutely arbitrary. And yet I was able to say to myself, well, no, this is professional, and it's my job as a supervisor to help someone become more professional. And so the truth is, while I felt badly that I might be offending or making Chanel upset, it never occurred to me that what I was doing was racist. It never crossed my mind, even though now it's obvious. But at the time, it never crossed my mind. And if someone had brought it up to me, I would have been like, what are you talking about? And so when I think about, well, can this happen now? Absolutely, because I think what happens is when we behave in ways that are racist, we don't realize we're doing it because we basically embed it in accepted terms like, oh, no, I'm just showing someone how to be professional. So that's why I think we really have to, in some ways, I think white people need to keep an eye on each other. You know, if someone had been there to call me out on it, it would have helped. As white folk, we give ourselves an entire language to justify our actions and in some way to blind ourselves to the fact that what we're doing is fundamentally racist. And I think that's why this is such a challenging topic and such a hard thing to fix.
I don't hear you saying microaggression anymore.
You know, the term microaggression is one that I've heard floated around. I'd be interested to know, I don't know much about how the term was created. I think as Chanel pointed out, what I did was not micro because it had a very long-lasting effect on her, you know, really for her entirety of her years in that position. So there was nothing micro about it. On the other hand, I don't personally think, I didn't see it as an aggression. It may have been an aggression. And that's where it's really interesting to think about perspective. I know I wouldn't be surprised if Chanel experienced it as an aggression. For me, I didn't think to myself, oh, I want to go be aggressive against this person. I just thought, oh, I want to please this higher up above me, and I'm going to, and I need to do this because it's my job. And so again, that's why these things are so dangerous, because you don't see that what you're doing is going to be experienced as an aggression. Now, I'm sure there are white people who are just flat out nasty and aggressive against people who are Black, and I'm sure that happens. But I think far more often, it's like what happened here, where I didn't perceive myself as being an aggressor, but yet Chanel essentially was just being almost assaulted by a system, by a process.
Chanel, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I just want to say something. It was the act of the senior administrator, that was very aggressive of her to come to you and to use you to tell me about my dress attire. That's where I came up with the term aggressive, because she was obviously very adamant about getting her point across to you. I mean, obviously we didn't have any interaction, so she was very aggressive in getting her point across to you to get to me. And that's why I did term this as an aggression.
Yeah, but I wouldn't let myself off the hook here too much, because
Correct.
Keep in mind, I wasn't, Lord knows, I was probably in my 30s at the time. So it's not like I was a child. And so I do have to accept full responsibility for the fact that I was the one who directly caused the harm. And, and the truth is,
correct.
If I had declined to do it, it's not like I would have lost my job. So, I think I have to accept responsibility here.
Oh, yes. I didn't, no, I wasn't saying that you were not responsible. You were totally responsible, Saul. I know I'm not taking that away, but I was just trying to explain why I used the term aggression, because that the act within itself was racial aggression. It was. In knowing this particular administrator, I can see that type of behavior coming from her.
I think that there's always so many situations where the initiation of aggression might occur at one level, but the decision that befalls the next person in the chain is whether to fold in the face of that request or that initiative or to oppose it. And opposing it isn't always high risk. Like here in this case, in retrospect, we don't think it would have been that high risk. Had young Saul Weiner known, it wouldn't necessarily have been that high risk to say, I think I'm going to decline this one, which would have led to a very different set of outcomes probably. But what we do when we're faced with something that's been initiated that's aggressive is a very important moral act. We have authority in those moments, and it matters. We didn't talk about sexism, but it seems like we should at least pause and note that this is a story about not just a person who's African American, but the responses of a white system to a woman. Is there anything either of you want to add on the fact that this involves a woman and not a man's dressing?
Chanel, do you want to go first on that one?
You can go ahead and take this one, Saul. I'll let you take that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is also a sexist. I think there was sexism here as well. And I think that's part of why I emphasized to Chanel at the time that I had been told this by a woman. I wanted to make it clear to her, and again, this makes me cringe now. It's very embarrassing to say this, but I wanted to make it clear that this wasn't quote unquote just my concern about the way she was dressed or another male's concern, but that this was coming from a female. And my thought was that would somehow remove the sexist aspects of this. But now when I look back on it, I realize that sexism isn't just about what a male says to a female. I mean, women can be implicated in sexism just as men can. And so I think that this senior administrator, who happened to be a woman, was also, in my opinion, behaving in a way that was sexist. And at some level, I must have known that because I was trying to explain it away to Chanel by saying that this came from a woman. And if I didn't realize it was sexist, then I probably wouldn't have had to say that, right? So at some level, I understood that this was a sexist action as well as, and I did not realize it was racist at the time, although of course I do now. People talk about the whole concept of intersectionality, which is this idea that you can kind of pile it on. You can harm people in multiple ways. You can be both racist and sexist at the same time.
Chanel, feel free to comment on the sexism, but I also want to ask you, is there a word of advice for women who are African American in any institution, but certainly healthcare institutions? Is there any advice or support we can offer them, or you can offer them? What do you do if you get this crap coming your way in 2021? Should you do anything, or is there an obvious pathway through? Because it seems like a dilemma.
That's a very interesting question. One thing I would say at this point in time is that you do not have to deal with that. Perhaps if it becomes too unbearable, if it happens on more than one occasion, I'm sure your institution has some type of EEOC or program or somewhere where you can go and you can report this form of discrimination. I would probably advise them to take that route if it's something that continuously to happen. But I do suggest and say that do not fall into the trap of losing yourself because of what someone else thinks of you or how you dress. Do not lose yourself.
Yeah.
Continue to be who you are because you are wonderfully made. That's scriptural. And you can perhaps even approach the offender, whether it be your boss or another senior administrator. You can even approach them and just let them know that they offended you. Because like I said earlier, I mean, these biases are formed every day by people that are non-Black. You form these biases, and they can be very detrimental in this type of institution because these are biases that you have formed about a certain group of people, whether it be Black, whether it be Hispanic, so on and so on. And before you know it, these biases just become an act of racism because of your perception about somebody. Then you act on that. And here you are, you doing something that's inappropriate.
Yeah.
Or saying something that's inappropriate. Or saying something that's racist. Or doing something that's racist.
So I think that's a remarkably helpful place to close our conversation because it points back toward the protection of healing relationships. Thanks so much, Chanel.
Oh, thank you.
Thank
Saul.
you, Chanel and Stefan. And just to echo what Stefan said, this podcast really is about healing. As you know, it's the title of it is On Becoming a Healer. I think that a conversation like this is really critical to that process of personal growth. It certainly has been for me. And certainly for that, Chanel, I thank you. And also, Stefan, I thank you for moderating this discussion.
Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you.
We hope you've enjoyed this latest episode of On Becoming a Healer. If you have, and you haven't already subscribed, please consider doing so now.